Today, we're at Wayland Smithy, which is a beautiful early Neolithic chambered long barrow. And it's quite an unusual type. It's part of what's called the Seven Cotswold group. It's a regional variant of barrow that's only really found in the southwest of Britain. It's believed it was completed about 3400 BC by pastoral communities just after they'd taken up agriculture, and it stands right next to the Ridgeway. If I turned around, the Ridgeway is less than 100 metres from me back there. It's by those trees. You can see very shallow chambered tomb. It's a barrow, but it's very shallow. It's not as tall as most. If you go to West Kennet or St Livens, they're much taller. Even Stony Littleton, which hopefully you saw a few weeks ago, I had to crawl on my knees to get into the opening and go into the chambers. Here, the chambers at the very beginning, it appears it didn't go all the way back in the barrow. Often the passage with the burial chambers would go back maybe a third, 2/3 of the way. Here it's more like 5%. There's a couple of chambers either side at the front behind where the door would have been. And then there's a dead end about 10 foot into the burial, maybe 20. But the mound continues for probably another 40 foot. It's quite substantial in length, very shallow, and possibly because it actually began as a wooden chambered tomb. So while there's stonework at the front and round the side, originally the digs done in the 1950s suggest that it was actually a wooden chambered tomb to begin with. It had a paved stone floor with two large posts at either end, and then there was a single crouched burial placed in there. So when I say single, you have to bear in mind that these burial mounds were communal, and actually this barrow, I believe it had 14 different individuals disarticulated. There's often suggestions in the literature that these chambered tombs were for a family or a community, and that possibly they were partly removed and returned or visited. It wasn't like a grave where they're buried. You re-entered the tomb through the front door. I always call it a door because I don't really have a better name for the stone slab that would have sealed the front of this tomb. This tomb, as I say, started off as a timber chambered tomb, and as new styles and vogue came from Europe, as they still do today, there was a change, and over the course of about 50 years, it was modified and became a stone because the four sarcens at the front were stood back up. They had collapsed and fallen over, and originally there'd been another two sarcens. Then at the front there's a shallow wall, and around the side there was a stone revetment which is fairly lost today. But this was all reconstructed in the 1950s. The barrow itself is actually quite a late example. It's about 200 years after West Kennet Long Barrow is when it seems to have fallen out of use. And obviously all of the human remains have been removed by the archaeologists. So today you see a striking structure, beautifully constructed and a little bit reconstructed. And you get a feeling for the capstone and the sarcens at the side. Why I definitely recommend this site is it's a beautiful, complete, and I do say that in air quotes, chambered tomb. And when you visit Devil's Den or Pitcotty House, you see a very similar structure, but stripped of the soil and all of the retaining wall and revetment, and all that you're left with is the standing stones and the capstone. When we visit the Devil's Den, you'll see how the stones have kind of collapsed sideways and the structure doesn't quite look like it should, whereas this is properly aligned chamber tomb entrance. The front very much reminds me of Stony Littleton. The steps are obviously a later addition so that tourists don't damage the tomb as they stomp around on it. But you can come up here and get quite a good view into it and understand the structure. It's a little bit different to a lot of the chamber tombs I've seen. That mostly they're on top of a hill and prominently on top of a hill. They might not be visible from the bottom of the hill, but when you're on there, you know you're on top of a hill. This is actually on top of a fairly big ridgeway. If you turn the other direction and go back about a mile, there's an A road. And I actually made the mistake of parking there and walking up from that. So probably best to cover here. Don't park on the A road. It's a terrible way to get here. It's a very steep hill, very long, and it's a long way away. Whereas actually, Wayland Smithy is on the Ridgeway. So the path that goes from just outside of Tring to Avebury, an old, certainly Neolithic and possibly earlier pathway that has been followed for centuries. And these farmers must have picked this spot to be close to the Ridgeway to live and trade. And then from there, they've, as they die, built this chamber tomb to have their ancestors close to them. And you can see here now it's surrounded by a beautiful grove of trees and behind the gorgeous rapeseed rolling off into the distance. But where the rapeseed finishes, that's where the very steep hill begins. So this is up on a hill as most are. But it's not as obvious. It's a very quiet spot. Because the nearest proper road is probably a mile away, it really feels like you're going back in the centuries. There's no obvious sign of modernity unless the tractor from the local farmer is rolling around the field as it was when I was here. The name of Wayland Smithy is interesting as well. If you've ever been to a smithy, it doesn't look anything like this at all. And who's Wayland? Well, there's a long history. You have to explain a structure like this, and if you don't understand it's a tomb, you make something up. Well, this was called Wayland Smithy or Wayland Smith. And according to Francis Wise, the underkeeper of the Bodleian Library in 1738, it goes back to local folklore. And that there was a story that there was an invisible smith who lived there, and if a traveller's horse had lost a shoe upon the road, they just had to bring the horse to the place with a piece of money, and leaving that, the horse would get a new horseshoe. Well, this folklore tale was quite persistent, and it's called Wayland Smith Forge in Walter Scott's novel Kenilworth from 1821. And when it was a 1-inch Ordnance Survey map, it was originally called Wayland Smith's Forge. But it's been called Wayland Smithy in one way or another for certainly 400 or 500 years. And believing of coins was actually becoming a bit of a problem. So in 2015, the local wardens from the National Trust, who every year, or presumably more often, would have to go and remove the coins that have been deposited. So in 2010, English Heritage removed information about the coin custom from the site's information panel. And people still leave coins, but they're now donated to local charities by the National Trust. When I get a chance, it might well be next year, I'd love to do a video walking along this ridgeway because it threads through some of the most significant sites in ancient Britain. And I have to think that Wayland Smithy was next to this ancient path because it's like buying a house near the A road or the motorway. You're going to be a farmer, you want to farm near to a road where you can actually sell your goods and take them to places, and this is a prime location in the Neolithic. I hope you enjoyed our quite brief visit to Wayland Smithy, and please do subscribe. We'll be back next Saturday with more Unbound Histories, looking at similar sites. And last week we went to Uffington White Horse, very close by.